Okay. All right. Let's put this in. Okay. The time frame that we are speaking about is what they call the 4th century, and it's in this century that several important things happen, and as we do, we'll just give a bit of a backdrop as to what kind of time this is, and then we'll launch into who we're going to speak about. The life in Eretz Yisrael at the time was sort of diminishing in its import, diminishing in its centrality. There was obviously already for 2 centuries no central Jewish government, no control of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And this was also the time in the 4th century where we had, Leslie, you emailed this, the end of the Sanhedrin, the dissolvement of the Sanhedrin. And it was at that time, although we're not going to talk about it, but it's definitely a good shot. You had Hillel Hasheni, the second Hillel, who created the Jewish calendar, the calendar that we follow today, who was a person who sanctified, he went ahead and sanctified every month. We know that a month is only a month, Rosh Chodesh, when it is created as such by us, by the Jewish people, and in lack of a Sanhedrin, it was Hillel Hasheni who created the calendar and sanctified every Rosh Chodesh from now until the time of Mashiach. Now, the good thing was that you had the Roman Empire that was very militant, very powerful during its time, which we spoke of extensively when we explored the 2nd century, the 3rd century, etc. We have now the Roman Empire becoming much less powerful. Their hold on Eretz Yisrael, and in general their hold on the Middle East was weakened. This happens at the time of Constantine, and when the Roman Empire splits, and it's not the way it used to be. Now this actually gave the opportunity to the Jewish people that they would have relief, relatively so, from the Romans, and that actually began the golden age for the Jewish people in Bavli, in Babylon. This is again, so the centrality of Eretz Yisrael is diminished. There's obviously always a Jewish community there. We're going to have the Talmud Yerushalmi being written over there, but nevertheless the center is in Bavli, and now Bavli is blossoming. And most, Jewishly and spiritually, most of the Torah greats, of the Torah sages, are now in Bavli. We mentioned the other time that there were yeshivas in certain cities in Bavli. Famous ones were Sura and Pumbedisa. Those were two, probably the most central places. We'll see soon that central location in Pumbedisa moved, at least for some time. And after the original, the person that we spoke of last time, after Rav, after his passing, that is when we officially begin the time of the Amoraim, although obviously in the time of Rav it also began, but Rav himself, we says, was a Tana, was somebody who, was sort of semi-Mishnah orientated. He was a person who was in a position to argue with a Tana, to argue with somebody who wrote the Mishnah. So, after the passing of Rav, we are definitely completely in the time of the Amoraim, the time of the people who eventually their teachings and their way of learning, their style, created the Torah Shebaal Peh, created the, not created the Torah Shebaal Peh, rather they created the framework of what we call today the Gemara, the Talmud. Now, the Torah Shebaal Peh was widened, there was more depth to it, and it was because of two individuals. I think we could say quite safely, two individuals that are not separable. The Zohar has a phrase, Trein rein de loimish parshin, two fellows, two friends that cannot be divided. It wasn't said about these two people, but I think it's possible that we could say it. The two people that defined and shaped the whole structure of the Talmud Bavli, which is what defines and shapes Jewish life today, and they are Abiy and Rovah. Now, we could talk about each one of them, either Abiy and or Rovah, but there is something which there is a Maimar Chazal, there is a saying from the sages in the Gemara, which I think it explains to us why we have to talk about these two people together. We can't really talk about one without the other. The Gemara says, this goes back to the original figure that we spoke of the first century, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And it says Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was well versed, was at home with the entire Torah, with everything, from beginning to end. Says the Gemara, Lohiniach, he did not let go dovar godoil v'dovar koton, a small thing or a big thing. He didn't let anything go. So the Gemara says, what is dovar godol? What is this big thing that we're talking about? What were the big things he didn't let go of? He said, Maaseh Merkava. Maaseh Merkava is what we call in our vernacular Kabbalah, metaphysical, that which goes on in the higher worlds. That's dovar godol. Dovar koton, the small things, the lesser things, havoyos de Abiy v'Rovah. The discussions, the wranglings of Abiy and Rovah. Now, this was 2.5 centuries before Abiy and Rovah came to the scene. And we're going to get to what that means. But what is for sure is that here we describe, how does the Gemara itself describe the discussions that that crystallize, that create the Torah Shebaal Peh, the Gemara that we have. What kind of discussions do that? What kind of who does this? Who did this? Who exemplified this? Who created this? This was Abiy and Rovah. Their discussions, their arguments together, they were the ones who really made this whole thing to be. Who made this whole thing to be. So we'll go through each one of them and then talk about how they interacted. Abiy was born about the year 278. There's a Gemara in Zvochim. The Gemara says that father was called Chailil, and his father was a Kohen, and that he descended actually from Eli the high priest, Eli the predecessor, the teacher of Shmuel, the famous stories about Eli. And it was actually the case that Eli's descendants, Tanakh already says this, that Eli's descendants, there was a thing about them that because of the actions of Eli that they did not live long, Eli's descendants, until a certain point. So this actually did happen with the father of Abiy as well as his uncle. We'll see soon. Abiy was an orphan from birth. Now that is a very unfortunate situation where you'll have the father passing away during the child's pregnancy and the mother passing away during birth. And this was the situation of Abiy. And Abiy was adopted by his aunt. Now we don't know her name. However, we do have many times, I think 24 times, I think, in the Gemara, that Abiy says, Omro li aim, my aim. Now aim is a mother, but he meant his mother who had adopted him. Omro li aim, my aim said to me. And it was it's about all sorts of things, usually about how things work in the world and how they have some sort of import in halacha. But then he was raised really by his uncle Ravba bar Nachmani, Ravba. Now there's an important distinction, which this is how it traditionally goes. There's been a lot of scholarly work done about this, but this is how it traditionally goes. Whenever in the Gemara you see Reish Beis Hey, you read it Rabbo. And usually you're talking about Abay's uncle, Ravba bar Nachmani, Rabbo. When you see Reish Beis Aleph is Rova. And that's how it's pronounced, Rabbo and Rova. Now, there's a lot of places in the Gemara where you have what we call the girsa, the question of whether this quote should be from Rabbah or this quote should be from Rova, whether the story happened with Rabbah or whether it happened with Rova. And it goes on and on like this because they had such a similar name that their identity became a little bit marred, a little bit mixed on various occasions. But anyway, that's the fact that you had Rabbah, who was the one who raised Abiy. Now, exactly what does Abiy mean? It's interesting. Many say his true name was actually Nachmani, and that's what some say, and that his name Abiy was an acronym, a Rosh Teves. And the Rosh Teves, the acronym is from a posuk. The verse says, Asher b'cho Yerucham Yosoim. The prophet says about Hashem, Asher b'cho, with you, Yerucham Yosoim, a orphan will have mercy. Hashem is the one who is merciful to the Yosim, to the orphan. So the Maharsha says that this is actually the reason why he was called Abiy. Asher b'cho Yerucham Yosim. Abiy, Aleph Beis Yud Yud. As some say, his name was actually Abba, and there is a it's sort of mystical. It's not very clear why his name is Abiy, but anyway, that is the way he is referred to. Now, Ravba, his uncle, was the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedisa, the great yeshiva in Pumbedisa, and the one who we call the Bar Plugta, the one with whom Ravba had constant dialogue with, was Rav Yosef. Again, this is Ravba, the uncle of Abiy, was Rav Yosef. Now, Ravba lived till only 40 years old. And actually, if we do the math, it comes out that he actually became the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedisa when he was 18 years old. So he was that kind of individual. But nevertheless only lived till 40. After Rabbah passed away, it was Rav Yosef who took over the yeshiva, leading the yeshiva in Pumbedisa. Abaye studied under both Rabbah and Rav Yosef, as well as also Rav Dimi, Rovin. Rav Dimi and Rovin were both individuals who had, we call today, made the Yeridah, had gone down from Eretz Yisrael to Bovel. That was simply the place to be in those times. The Torah was there. So one of the reasons why a person may go out of Eretz Yisrael, may leave Eretz Yisrael, is to study Torah. Meaning, if there's not the quality of Torah that there is in another place, then a person is allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael and go to the place where they are able to learn Torah properly. In this case, this was Bovel. Bovel actually at that Eretz Yisrael, Israel at that time was conquered by the Byzantines, and this had, the era of the Byzantine rule over Eretz Yisrael had started, and it wasn't a great scene over there apparently in the beginning. So there was a flow of Jews who came down from Eretz Yisrael to Bovel. Abai actually said that he was very impressed with the sages that came from Eretz Yisrael. He says that Chad Minayhu, one of them, is better than two of us. And Rabbo, however, said, well, you're right, but if one of us would go up to Eretz Yisrael, then we would be as two of them. Meaning that there was greatness in the Torah of Bovel, that if you put that together with the Torah of Eretz Yisrael, you'd really have it all. You'd have it all plus. But anyway, we know there was a different way of learning. It was a different style, and what Abaye was pointing out was there was a certain clarity with the Torah of Eretz Yisrael that did not exist in what's his name, in Bovel. Yehudi, yeah, 1 sec, I gotta yes, I can try and hear you.
I would like to suggest a slightly different way. You can't hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Now it's good. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. I just put in okay, slightly different viewpoint. One, I don't think the Byzantine took over Eretz Yisrael. They actually imposed Christianity there until the late 4th century, which is more like 375, not 275. That's a minor point. The major point is that the problem with that kind of approach is that it basically gives people an excuse to leave Eretz Yisrael. And indeed, I think that's exactly what happens. When we say that's correct about the first temple, but that's not correct about the second temple, which is what the Ikar Galut is. Why is it not correct? Because the Romans never did a mass expulsion of the Jews from Eretz Yisrael. That's what the Babylonians did. That's what the Assyrians did. But that's not what the Romans did. They did not force us into exile. We went on our own. In other words, we left Eretz Yisrael of our own volition to go into Galut, and you might even say that the existence of the Yeshiva Dubara provided a convenient excuse for people to leave.
Well, I think the yeshivas in Bovel came before the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, as far as I understand it. Number one.
No. But the real deal with the Yeshiva Bovel starts with Rab. Like you yourself point to that.
Yeah. Right. So
up to that point, the Yeshiva Bovel would in no way a draw. They only become a draw after the Mishnah is published.
Right, with Rav going to Bovel.
Yeah, and that becomes a big problem. And you quoted one place about, but there's other places where in Eretz Yisrael, in my second Sanhedrin, I believe it's around Daf Mount Zion, I'm not absolutely certain, but in somewhere in the area, it says, they quote the pasuk from Eicha, B'macha shakim ho shivani, to Metei Olam, and they say, B'macha shakim ho shivani, zo Talmudah shel Bavel. Yeah, and that's not a quote from the Yerushalmi, that's a quote from the Bible.
Oh, that we know, yeah, that's an old thing. I hear you. The point was that was the way it was. The way it was that there was the Torah learning was just better there, and do we have in halacha we have today that there's a person is not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael only for certain things. One of them is to find a wife if you can't find one in Eretz Yisrael. And the other one is Lilmod Torah. There's not to learn Torah. There's not that many other. I don't think there is any other official allowances for leaving Eretz Yisrael. Why those?
That halakha comes from the Bible. That's really what you call. In other words, I have the feeling that the day's going to come as a result of the fact that we're getting into the Yerushalmi a lot more seriously than we ever did before, and our school is publishing the Yerushalmi in English with a decent, explanation, making it available. I think time's going to come when we're going to see the strangeness of the situation. That the entire rabbinic literature, every single part of it was written in Eretz Yisrael. The Yerushalmi, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Mechilta, the Sifra, the Sifrei, all the Medrashim. Okay? And the one book that was written in Galut, which is the Bible, has become the canonized book. Don't you find that to be a little bit strange? The Bible has a Galut mentality. Okay? And yes, it's always pushing the Galut in the way where it makes it convenient for people to set themselves up outside of Eretz Yisrael. Why do we canonize the only rabbinic work that was written outside of Eretz Yisrael? Doesn't that seem weird? Okay? I have a feeling the day's going to come when the Yerushalmi is going to supersede the Bible because of the fact that basically now we're back in Eretz Yisrael. We have big, huge yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. No one in Eretz Yisrael could ever say they have to leave Eretz Yisrael in our time in order to learn Torah.
Okay, good.
Okay, that might have been an excuse they could have used 200 years ago, but they sure could have used that excuse today.
No. So, Abiy, what did he do? Who was Abiy and how did he spend his day? The interesting thing is the Gemara says is that and this may have been due to the circumstances of Abiy's birth and upbringing, that Abiy was never particularly well off. He was quite poor for much of his life. He worked the land. He was a farmer. The Gemara says that he watered his fields at night and he learned by day, which is an interesting way of doing it. It's hard to water a field unless it's a small field by night. But anyway, they didn't have floodlights in those times. But he spent his days learning. Abiy sold wine at a certain time, but he made a living in a difficult way, and much of his life he was quite poor. He married a woman called Choyma. Now this Choyma was a daughter of the sage Isi Berab Yitzchak, and she was Isi Berab Yitzchak was a grandson of Rabbi Yehuda. So Isi Berab Yitzchak Berab Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. So she was a granddaughter of Rabbi Yehuda, quoted in the Gemara so many times. She had a very unfortunate family life in that she married three times. Abiy was her third husband, and although being a very good woman and a very beautiful woman, the Gemara says, nevertheless this was her story. And there was a question whether Abiy should marry her. People said not to. He did end up marrying her and passed away. Abiy did during her lifetime. Abiy had a son who we know about very famously called Rabbi Bar Abiy. Now again, I must say, whenever we say the names of these people, maybe not Abai and Ravah, but Bibi bar Abai, so then you have the various versions of the Gemara now that they have Bei Vai and Bei Voi, and you go to different yeshivas and they have the Gemara doesn't have vowels, and it never did until recently, with various editions. The various editions argue as to quite a bit as to how to vowelize, how to vocalize some of the words. I say the names as the way I had it in yeshiva. I can't really get it out of my system, so whether right or wrong, it might be wrong. It might be wrong. Probably is in this case. Bibi, I don't know. Bibi is the Israeli prime minister. But anyway, Beis Yud. That's what it says. So Rabbi bar Abaye mentioned many times in the Gemara. So he had a very illustrious son, that we do know. Abaye met Ravah in Pumbedisa. That's quite clear. The yeshiva, the great yeshiva in Pumbedisa, where Abaye's uncle Rebbe was the Rosh Yeshiva, where Abaye learnt. That's where he met Ravah. Now Ravah, according to most, is a shortened form of Rebbe Abba or Rav Abba. Abba was very, very, very usual, a very common name at the time, and so Ravah, many will say, is a shortened form of Reb or Rebbe, Rav Abba. Ravah was the son of Rabbi Yosef bar Choma, and he had a very different background and upbringing than Abaye did, materially speaking. He was born, raised, and lived in a town called Mechuza. Now yeshivas we said Mechuza. So Mechuza was a very, very interesting town. A lot of very interesting, peculiar, even amusing stories are told in the Gemara about the people of Mechuza. Quite strange at certain times, but Mechuza actually, as we'll see, did end up becoming a tourist center. Although many of the people living there before and during the time of Ravah were quite well off. They were affluent. It was going good for them materially, spiritually. It was there was a little bit more to be desired. That's something that Ravah eventually was instrumental in mending, in improving. Ravah himself also came from a wealthy family. He married the daughter of a very well-known Talmudic sage and Amira, the daughter of Rav Chisda, Bas Rav Chisda. She is known as that, the daughter of Rav Chisda. We don't actually know her name. We do know, however, that Ravah very much honored her, held her in very high regard, and once he expressed himself, you could take anything and everything away from me, just not the daughter of Rav Chisda. That's how much he was bound with her. Ravah had fields, he owned vineyards, he sold wine, he owned ships or boats that would travel on the Tigris with various wares. Mechuza was a city of a lot of trade, which is why many of the people there were wealthy. He, growing up, and as he grew in prominence, Ravah became also very well connected with the Reish Galusa, with the head of the exile, the political leader of the Jews in Bavel, and also with the ruling class in the area, in Babylon. This was not known so much, it seems, during Ravah's lifetime, but Ravah was quite instrumental in secret diplomacy by way of what we call schmearing, bribery. He would push money into the coffers of the ruling class in Babylon, and because of that, the things went very, very smoothly. As they say in Yiddish, as a schmiert fortman. If you schmear, you travel. So the things there was relative peace and tranquility for the Jewish community in his times due to his diplomacy. The Gemara says that Ravah had, as we'll see soon, several teachers, several rebbes, and the Gemara says that Rovah once expressed himself, and he says, I asked of Hashem, I prayed for 3 things. He said, 2 things I was granted, the 3rd thing I wasn't granted. He says, the first thing I asked for was one thing he asked for was the riches of Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda was wealthy, and he got that. He said, I asked for. I have to have it clear here. 1 second. Anyway, he said, I asked for the humility. The 3rd thing was, he said, he asked for the humility of Rabba bar Rav Huna. He said the humility he wasn't given. So he got 2 things. I've just the third thing has slipped for me for 1 second. I just gotta. I'll check it in a second. You gotta have this. You gotta have it in completion. Once I gotta look at the Gemara here. Bear with me.
It seems to me if you have to ask for humility, you're in trouble.
Yeah, is that what they say? Right. I hear. That's it. All right. Give me. When you want to find it, you don't find it, right? Oh, here we go. The wisdom. So he asked for 3 things. He asked for the wisdom of Rav Huna. That's what it was. The wisdom of Rav Huna, and he received it. He asked for the riches of Rav Chisda, and he received it, but he asked for the humility of Rabba bar Rav Huna, and he did not receive it. So now this is interesting because that itself seemed to be an expression of his humility, because something which is very interesting about Rovah in the Gemara is that we have several retractions from Rovah. One famous line he says, "Dvorim she'amarti lifnechem tosu." The things that I told you, he said at some point. The things that I told you, they were a mistake. He said he retracted. So he did have enough humility to do that. Which we don't find many times or by many others in the Gemara. So that's something which specifically by Rovah. The Gemara also mentions how Rovah was well versed in Kabbalah, in the esoteric element of the Torah, and that he also knew what we call Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, and created what we call a golem, a man out of clay. It's sort of an image of a person that had some sort of life to it. It's a clear Gemara in Moed Katan, and so Rovah was quite well versed and sort of had entered that sphere quite deeply. Many stories in the Gemara how Rovah was engaged with tzedakah. He used to go around, and he says even examples in the Gemara where he literally made people give him money. He said, "You have to give me this sum of money." He knew they could do it, and he got it out of them. He pushed the people in mechuzah to give tzedakah. He himself, he was a wealthy person, he supported many poor Torah scholars, Torah sages who were not able to afford their own living, although he did encourage his students to go home. Tishrei and Nisan, month of Tishrei and the month of Nisan, to do business, to get some money, so when they come back, they could, they don't have to worry about funding. He was very particular, Rovah was, about the honor due to elders, people of age, and especially to people who knew Torah. We have a saying in the Gemara, which the Gemara says is Margala bepume de Rava. This was something that Rava would say all the time. He was accustomed to saying this. Tachlis chochma teshuva u'masim tovim. The purpose, the objective of all wisdom meaning Torah, is teshuva and good deeds. In other words, that we cannot suffice with the knowledge. The knowledge has an objective. The objective is teshuva, the return, connection, bond to Hashem, and good deeds, doing mitzvahs. Abiy and Rovah had teachers, had rabbeim who were the generation prior to them of the Amoraim. So Rovah, for example, we know he studied by Rav Nachman, by Rav Chisda, by Rav Yosef, as we mentioned before. Again, also by Rovin, Rav Schoirod, people who came from Eretz Yisrael, Rav Asi, who came from Eretz Yisrael. So they studied with the creme de la creme, with the greatest sages that there were in Bovel, who we know so well, so to say, from the Gemara. Now, Abiy and Rovah have literally hundreds of arguments in the Gemara. They are mentioned, not arguing, they're mentioned thousands of times in the Gemara. Now, thousands of times, means that you cannot turn a couple pages. Sometimes you will have it on every page for many, many pages. A dafim in the Gemara where you will have Abiy and Rovah, either Abiy or Rovah, or Abiy and Rovah arguing about something. So literally, this is the very backbone, the very build, the very shaping of the Talmud Bavli. Its definition was created by the arguments of the discussions of Abiy and Rovah. So this is again the Gemara says that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, all that time before, what did he understand? What did he perceive? What did he know? What was there to know about the oral Torah? All the discussions that we know as the discussions of Abiy and Rovah. The very fascinating thing is that the halacha follows Rovah for the vast majority of cases. In fact, there's only 6 cases, famous cases, which there's an acronym for these cases called Ya'al Kagam, Yud Ayin Lamed Kuf Gimel Mem. 6 cases which start with these Yud is Yiyush Shaloi Midas, or etc. So these are 6 cases which each one starts with that letter, either Yud, an Ayin, a Lamed, etc. Where the halacha, where the law follows Abiy. Everything else, in all other instances, the halacha follows Rovah. Now, there's a question as to why that is and how that became to be, but that's the reality. Now, the Meiri is a commentary, a very early commentary on the Gemara, and he goes as far as saying this, and this is why I think we started with the fact that Abiy and Rovah have to be put together as the shapers of Jewish life in their time and for all time. In that it was in the discussions of Abiy and Rovah that the Meiri says that everything was discussed. They discussed everything. In other words, if we build things on the Mishnah, we take the Mishnah, and so they went through every Mishnah and the details of every Mishnah and the questions and the reasoning, why and how, etc. So they went through everything. They questioned everything. They answered whatever they could answer about these questions, and they organized everything in these discussions. So, in other words, if you take all the what is the Gemara, if you want to say it in a sentence, is that all the Mishnahs, all the Mishnayos are taken apart. You have a Mishnah, and then you have the Gemara says, okay, well, it says this in the Mishnah, well, let's see, let's examine, let's question, let's bring another place where it says the opposite, etc. So you take apart the whole Mishnah, that is the Gemara. And that is what, at least orally, Abiy and Ravah did together. And so when you break everything apart and you put it back again, and you organize what you've broken apart, and you sort of ultimately transcribe it, that is the description of the Talmud Bavli. That is the description of what the Gemara is. And so that's what they did, and that is why the Gemara that we have can be classified, can be described as Havoyos da Abiy v'Ravah, the wrangling, the arguments, the discussions of Abiy and Ravah. That can simply be its description, and that is why we must speak about them together. Now, although they were in constant dialogue, Abiy and Ravah were very different. And this difference of Abiy and Ravah goes back to a very famous discussion of the Gemara and the Gemara in Horius. The Gemara has a question. What is better, Sinai or Oiker Horim? Sinai is Sinai, like Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. And Sinai is a person, is a description of a person who knows it all, who is well versed in everything. In other words, just like we say at Sinai, all the information was given, everything was given to the Jewish people at Sinai. So a person who is a Sinai is a person who knows it all, everything, as if he stood at Sinai. He knew it. He knows it as if he was there. Oiker Horim means an uprooter of mountains, a person who can uproot mountains. You have a mountain, something that seems very steady, and you have a person who can uproot it, who can take it, crumble the whole thing. Meaning a person who can plumb down, who can delve deeply into the meaning of something, into question its entire basis, go down to its very roots, and may not have all the information, may not be this encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is the Sinai. The Oiker Horim is a person who knows what they know, obviously know a lot, but they plumb down to the depths and to the essence of what they know, rip it all to shreds and start again, as they say. Now, Abiy was the kind of person, the kind of sage, who was followed the kind of model of Sinai much more. The one who exemplified the Sinai was his teacher, Abiy's teacher, Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef was the Sinai. Now, Ravah was the person who was the Oiker Horim. He was the sharper person, the one who plumbed to the depths. Which, again, the Gemara isn't sure. The Gemara leaves it with a teiku. The Gemara says we will leave it unanswered as to which one is better. Ultimately speaking, there were those who said Sinai is better because you always need the one who knows everything. If you have the encyclopedia, you have the person who knows everything, then you can come and delve deeply into what they know. But you have to, the Gemara says, Hakol tzrichin lemoreh chitaya. Everybody needs the one who sells the wheat. Everyone needs the baker. He's got the bread. He's got the wheat. You can't survive without the wheat. So knowing everything has a tremendous virtue. However, and this can be the reason, it can be at least a contributing factor to why the halacha in the vast majority of cases follows Ravah, is because Ravah was able to penetrate to the very depths of things. Ravah himself said that he would rather it's better a little bit of hot pepper than a basket full of gourds, full of kishuim. Kishuim is cucumbers. Better a little bit of hot pepper, better a little bit of the real stuff than, a whole basket full of bland stuff, full of things, just things. He was up there, he was in there for the quality. Now, after the passing of Rav Yosef, it was Abiy that became the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedisa, in that famous yeshiva, the great yeshiva of Pumbedisa. And the reason was because of Abiy's quality in the Sinai area. There was the convention, the board, I don't know how it worked then, but it was a convention of sages who decided would be the ones who would put the Rosh Yeshiva, would put him into place. And when Rav Yosef passed away, Abiy was very, very, we find Abiy in a very, very humanistic and very kind way, treating Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef grew old and actually forgot his learning, and Abiy would learn with him and bring back his learning to him. But Abiy was appointed the Rosh Yeshiva because the decision was that somebody who was able to give a teaching, say a shiur, give a class, so to say, without anybody being able to argue with them, then they would be the ones to get the position. So Rovva's entire way of learning was, he was, there was something, and then there was a question, and on that you can ask another question, you can answer the answer, and nothing. If you're that kind of, if you learn in that style, then many things are left unopen. Whereas Abiy, he had the information, so he taught. He says, this is what I heard, this is what I have. He gave it. You can't argue with that. That's what it is. He taught the information. So Abiy got the position of the Rosh Yeshiva. Now, Rovva, was felt that he couldn't remain in Pumbedisa because of that, and therefore he left Pumbedisa and went to his hometown of Mechuzah, and he became it seems that he, I don't know if he created the yeshiva in Mechuzah, but what's for sure is that Mechuzah was, as a place of Torah, only became what it became by virtue of Rovva going there, and created a place of Torah learning in Mechuzah. Now Abiy served for about 13 or 14 years as a Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedisa, and Abiy passed away around the year 338. Now, upon Abiy's passing, Abiy again passed away young. Upon Abiy's passing, the convention of the yeshiva in Pumbedisa wanted to give the position of being Rosh Yeshiva, head of the yeshiva. They wanted to give it to Rovva. But Rovva, once he left Pumbedisa, he wasn't going to start returning. And so what basically happened is that the yeshiva in Pumbedisa dissolved. People knew Rovva was in Mechuzah, so whether it officially or kind of by default, whatever the case was, the travel went from Pumbedisa to Mechuzah, and Mechuzah became the place of the center of Torah in Bovel, led and by virtue of the personality of Rovva. Rovva passed away about the year 353, so not that much later than Abiy. But even after Rovva's passing, Mechuzah still remained to be a center of Torah for a while afterwards. Now, as far as the students of Rovva and of also Abiy, although many of these people were going to enumerate are officially students of Rovva, but it's quite certain, as we just mentioned, that it was only it was the students of Abiy. Abiy had led the yeshiva for 13 years. It was the students of Abiy that traveled to Rovva, to Mechuzah, to become his students. And so these people that are considered officially the students of Ravah may have many of them, maybe all of them, studied under Abiy. So there was students of both. Abiy and Ravah, as you said, had very different ways of studying, and for many of them, it was actually it was impossible for them, especially during the lifetime of Abiy and Ravah, when Abiy and Ravah lived at the same time. Many of the students of Ravah couldn't get themselves to sit and be taught by Abiy. It was such a different. They said, one is compared to Abiy is compared to chewing bones, and Ravah is compared to having a piece of meat. It was a different story. It was a different way. But anyway, these are the students were the next generation of the people who were the Amoraim, the people who contributed to the Talmud Bavli, and their students were borderline. They came very close to the time of the actual finishing of the ending of the canonization of the Babylonian Talmud. So you'll have people who, like Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Rav Papa, Rav Huna Bereder Rabbi Yeshua, not Rav Huna. Rav Huna was before Ravah. Rav Huna Bereder Rabbi Yeshua, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Ameimar Marzutra. Again, these are people which are very famous all over the place in the Gemara. This was the next generation of Amoraim. What is very fascinating is, and you mentioned Yehudi about Eretz Yisrael, that the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchok Luria, famous Kabbalist who lived in Tzfas about 500 years ago, the Arizal stated that, and he writes this, his student, Rab Chaim Vital, writes this, and he states that Abiy and Ravah are both buried together in a little town about 3 miles from Tzfas, and in the north of Israel, in the Galil. And he describes over there, and this is in Shar HaGilgulim, in the book of Reincarnation, one of the books of the Arizal transcribed by his student, Rav Chaim Vital, and he describes to the most minute detail a cave, and there was a kuchin are little slots in a cave where the dead were buried, and he describes exactly how the cave looked, how many kuchin, how many slots there are in the cave, and he tells you exactly which one of those are the burial place of Abiy and Ravah, and that they are buried in the same cave. Now, such a cave with this description was found in this place relatively recently in Israel. And today, if you go to the north of Israel, there is the little place not far from Tzfas where you have what they call the Ma'ora, the cave of Abiy and Ravah, which meant that they had been asked if we know that this is the case. The Arizal does say that they were buried in Israel, so if this is the place, then this is the place. It meets the description according to many opinions. So they were buried at least in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, and so we have it's a little town called Yavnis, I think, and that's where they lie until today. Now, so again, the very existence and the very build-up of the Talmud Bavli is described as the discussions of Abiy and Ravah. The law follows Ravah, but there is, I think it's quite clear, there is no Babylonian Talmud. There is no Talmud without these two individuals. Who did it all, said it all, taught it all, and that eventually gave the ability for all this to be transcribed and put down. And as we'll see next time, please God, we will study the century and the individual in that century who ultimately transcribed, edited, canonized the Talmud Bavli, which we learn and study and cherish until today. Okay, so Yehudi,
I have one comment.
Yeah.
Talking about the graves that they discovered in Israel, 2 Babylonians.